Modern policing just took a DNA test. Turns out it's 99 to 100% racist. Previously on Decoded, we talked about how the cops don't exactly spend their time keeping us safe, despite how often they tell us that's their job. Here's the TLDR. Addressing violent crime makes up a very small percentage of police work. Most crimes go unsolved, and the Supreme Court affirmed that officers don't actually have a constitutional obligation to intervene if you're in danger. They're about as legally bound to your well-being as the stranger you asked to watch your laptop at the coffee shop. So what exactly are the police here to do, and how did we end up where we are now? Well, to answer those questions, we have to look at the history of policing and the institutions that provided a blueprint for modern law enforcement. And to all of our "what about the white people" commenters, don't worry. Unless you were uber wealthy, the police were initially formed to suppress your rights too. When we look back as far as the 1700s, policing has largely been centered around protecting property and maintaining a status quo shaped by white supremacy and capitalism. And that hasn't changed much over the last few centuries. Policing got its start regionally, from slave patrols in the South to Union strikebreakers in the North and the Texas Rangers in the early Western US. And as history shows, the police have been pretty terrible everywhere. So let's get started with one of the most horrifying ancestors of modern law enforcement: slave patrols. During the early 1700s, plantation owners in the South developed slave patrols, the first form of law enforcement that resembles the police we see today. The thing is, at the time, the law treated black people as property, not humans, so these groups were designed to punish and return runaways or those who were seen as rebelling, aka people just trying not to be enslaved. Slave patrols restricted black people's freedom of movement by employing lower and middle-class white men who, armed with whips and guns, would patrol from sunup to sundown. According to historians, the duties of patrollers included apprehending runaways, monitoring black movement, breaking up gatherings of black people, randomly searching slave quarters, inflicting impromptu punishments, and suppressing insurrections. I wonder where the ideas for programs like stop and frisk and no-knock warrants could have possibly come from. As historian Sally Haddon explained in her book on slave patrols, quote, "The history of police work in the South grows out of this early fascination by white patrollers with what African American slaves were doing. And by the end of the Civil War and the Reconstruction era, local sheriffs became the primary law enforcement in the South, and they picked up right where the slave patrols left off by enforcing segregation and disenfranchisement. Despite the abolition of slavery in 1865, the giant gaping loophole in the 13th Amendment enabled police in the South to find new ways to force black people into exploitative labor. Because remember, the 13th Amendment states, neither slavery nor involuntary servitude shall exist within the United States except as a punishment for crime. As a result, lots of new anti-black laws emerged in the South, such as the Black Codes, which restricted black freedom and compelled newly freed slaves to work for low wages, as well as Jim Crow laws, which legally enforced segregation. There were also a host of other laws, such as vagrancy laws, that criminalized being unemployed, as well as localized legislation that prohibited black communities from gathering in groups to worship. These laws were passed in order to criminalize and push black people into prisons and convict leasing, a system of prison labor where prisoners were a source of free labor for white-owned businesses as punishment for a crime. Police used these racist rules as a pretext to surveil, abuse, and detain black people under the guise of justice. It's no coincidence that the focus on punishment and control during this time paved the way for the expansive systems of mass incarceration today. Because thanks to the 13th Amendment, prisons are still allowed to use inmates for labor and their own profit, often paying them less than $1 per hour, or in states like Georgia and Texas, paying them nothing at all. This is still legal. Sorry, let me rephrase. How in the is this still legal? Well, constitutional amendments only go as far as the people in power are willing to let them. But the racist, pro-capitalist roots of policing aren't geographically limited to the South. So let's move on to northern strikebreakers. During the 1800s, shippers and business owners in northern states convinced local governments to publicly fund forces to protect their assets and financial interests, which often translated to breaking up workers' unions. In other words, the earliest forms of police in the North were paid for by tax-paying citizens so the richest of the rich could have the government fight against terrible things like 8-hour workdays, child labor laws, and having a weekend. For example, in 1877, a Chicago business group called the Citizens Association raised $28,000 to buy rifles, cannons, and cavalry equipment to combat worker strikes in the city. But why spend your own money when you can spend tax money? Fast forward 20 years to the city of Latimer, Pennsylvania. When over 300 coal miners went on strike and refused to disperse, police under the direction of a Pennsylvania county sheriff opened fire on demonstrators, killing 19 people. When organized workers threatened the wealth of the rich and powerful, they were framed as violators of the law, which provided an opening for police to squash dissent. But the North-South divide still doesn't encompass the full scope of the racist and xenophobic institutions that provided the foundation for police today. So up next is the colonialist West. As far back as the 1830s, police entities like the Texas Rangers were on the front lines of the United States' violent expansion westward, working to dispossess land through the brutalization and murder of indigenous populations. There's a reason Walker Texas Ranger was played by a Chuck Norris and not a Chuck Berry. After the Mexican Revolution in 1910, the Texas Rangers grew rapidly until the organization expanded to more than 1,300 officers. Then from 1915 to 1917, Texas Rangers working with local law enforcement killed over 100 Mexican residents, rising out of the criminalization of Mexican people near the border. All of this culminated in the 1918 PORVENIR massacre, when the Texas Rangers murdered 15 unarmed locals under the false pretense that they were harboring bandits. One Army official at the time called it wholesale murder, and it caused such a public stir that it prompted state-level legislative hearings into the misconduct of the Rangers throughout Texas. The State House investigation concluded that the Texas Rangers had committed many atrocities and extrajudicial killings, particularly of ethnic Mexicans. And one action the State House took was to reduce the size of the Texas Rangers, which is kind of like an early version of defund the police. The racist and xenophobic legacy of the police runs deep, meaning the violence we see enacted today isn't by accident. The criminal justice system isn't broken. It's working exactly as designed. An institution built not for public safety, but for race and class control. One that's done little to change the racist frameworks that informed its popularization. That is why many activists are calling to defund, reform, or abolish policing and prisons, and for the development of models of safety that actually act in the interest of the general public, not just those who are white and rich. In the coming episodes, we'll look beyond the roots of modern policing to how we can transform it. Until then, thanks for watching, and we'll see you next time right here on Decoded.